Hey everybody, and welcome to yet another video on how to have your best game ever. I'm Monte Cook. With me is Darcy Ross, and we are here talking about topics that are covered in even more depth in this book right here, now available from every awesome retailer that you can think of, and as well as montecookgames.com. And today is the day that we're going to start talking about some of the stuff that you've been asking about. We've talked about sort of how to get started as a GM and, world building and stuff like that. But now let's talk about the stuff that's really kind of the advanced GMing stuff, right? This is for those of us that have been doing this for a while and you really want to take your game to the next level. Darcy, you have a lot of experience running games. I know I've played in your games and they were really fun. So let's just start at the beginning, right? What's one of your favorite ways to start like a new campaign?
Ooh, good question. I do so much of my GMing style has become responding to the players. And so the more that I can kind of front load a campaign with getting lots of good information about the players and their characters and what they're looking for, the easier and more impactful sort of my whole campaign can be. So I find that one thing that really helps is, in information gathering sessions, like a session zero, right? So, hey, let's get everybody around a table. And I've noticed that some people mean different things by session zero. So maybe we can sort of define two modes of session zeroing that I've seen. Right. So one might be, you gather your players around. Maybe you're doing a little bit of character generation together. Maybe you're talking about what you want out of the campaign. Sort of a big conversation. Sort of setting goals, setting mood and tone, and just kind of having a big conversation about that. I've seen sort of that kind of let's all talk about this as a session zero. I've also heard people talk about a session zero as okay, we're trying a new system, we're trying a new thing. Let's just try and play through a session, and it's the pilot episode, and we'll throw it out. We'll throw it out if we don't like it, right? But it lets everybody kind of, okay, how did we like that mood, and that do we feel like the goals we have with this campaign are sort of being fit by the characters we picked, and the optional mechanics we're engaging with, right? So I've seen people think about a session zero as a literal session where you play through. It's like the dress rehearsal of your campaign, right? What do you usually mean when you say session zero, Monty?
I like that. I like the trial run kind of idea. I think the session zeros that I have had have been focused more on character creation. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when I was designing Invisible Sun, I hard coded it into the game. Where we just call it the first session. Because I didn't call it session zero because I just thought it was so fundamental that I didn't, session zero kind of almost sounds like the game hasn't really started yet. Yeah. And I wanted to hard code it in because in the first session of Invisible Sun, you not only kind of talk about your characters and whatnot, but you actually, as a group, generate, your characters' neighborhoods and what's going on and who everyone's neighbors are and stuff like that. To kind of give both them and the GM stuff to play with, right? As a group.
Yeah, one of the effects of that kind of, especially the first session, is it, as a player, I really struggle with finding my character early on in a campaign. It usually takes me a while, but I find that something like a first session where your play has started, the play may not look like session 2 and 3 and 4, but you are getting a sense of your character and you're trying to think about living in the world and the air that they breathe, right? I find that really useful for like having my footing when I actually get started playing. And I think there's some other ways that people have that GMs can sort of give players this sort of on-ramp into finding their character footing. And one of those ways is sort of like solitary starts, sort of prologues, or other kind of single character focused opportunities to sort of play and to storytell a little bit and kind of warm up into your character and figure out, let them breathe a little bit and figure out who they are on their own, so that when you join the whole rest of the team and you have the whole cast there together on screen, you can sort of have a better sense of the character right away and get right into building those connections between your character and everybody else.
The single best campaign start that I ever had was doing that. And I will admit, it's a luxury, right? Because you've got to be able to, make time so that you can have an individual session with each player. These don't have to be like full 4-hour Friday night kind of things, right? They might only be an hour or whatever, but it's fantastic. I think in an earlier video, we talked about how when you're making your character as a player, think more about the stuff that happened to you last week than the stuff that happened to you when you were a kid, right? Because that's the kind of stuff that you can sort of bring in as a talking point, so to speak. Like, I saw this weird thing. Maybe we should go check it out. But these prologues actually give you that stuff, right? You can literally talk about, as a group, the stuff that has already happened to you in character. And that's really cool, right?
Absolutely. Chewy would like a prologue now. Yeah, Chewy, you reminded me. Those prologues can be things that you flash back to later. So, if you're already GMing a campaign, lovely GMs to whom we're talking, you can actually insert these prologues later on in a campaign as well. This is something you can flash back to. We're going to talk about playing with time as GMs a little bit later in the episode. But so one thing that I've seen work pretty well that was really fun is, a given session, you might want a little bit of role-playing warm-up, right? For one reason or another, or you're just at sort of a transition in your campaign and you kind of you have an opportunity to play with time in a big way. So my roommate, John Harness, has had a D&D game where in one of his best sessions was starting out a session and, for about 5 to 10 minutes, each player sort of got to role play, like, how did you join the party, right? Like, let's flash back to the sort of incident event that got you to leave your home and go join these vagabonds to adventure across the world, right? And players found it really fun, and it infused the whole campaign with this energy, and you've added new information, and kind of everybody's characters are getting looked at in this new light. So I guess my point is prologues are extremely effective at the beginning of a campaign, but maybe don't discount that sort of thing later on in your campaign as well.
Speaking of doing stuff that comes a little bit later, I'm reminded that another really interesting thing that you can do is give your players permission, say, after the first couple of sessions, to rejigger their characters.
Oh, totally.
Right? It's like, I made this character and now I'm going to play him in this, 6-month campaign, but I didn't give him the right skills, right? Or I didn't give her the right background or whatever. And that can really make a huge difference. And, why not? Right? Yeah. If you're going to play the character a long time, it's not like it's going to be this huge retcon continuity error kind of thing, right?
That's so smart. I'm definitely like a polygamerist person, right? I'm constantly want to try the new shiny, try a new system. I sort of have the things that are, easy for me to run that I want to run all the time, but I also want to check out new stuff. And, especially if you're the GM who's got a group of players who are very kindly going along with your, new shiny, let's play a new game, giving them the opportunity to tweak their experience a little bit will make them probably a little more open to trying new systems because they know they won't be penalized for not having that system mastery yet. That's a great point.
Yeah. I am also a fan of giving players homework. And what I mean by that is putting a little of the onus on them because if the campaign starts out and it's just sort of the GM talking at the players for a long, long period of time,
yeah,
it's hard to absorb everything. And I'm not, if I'm listening to the GM for 20 minutes, I'm not getting into character. I'm not like thinking about my character. So one thing that the GM can do is give the players sort of the responsibility to come up with 2 or 3 or 5 adventure hooks, basically.
yeah.
Like things that that could be springboards for further adventures, because I've got a sister and she's a wizard and she's doing this thing, or it's just like, boy, I sure would love to get a high position in this corporation one day, or things like that. Not only does that help the GM think about what kind of adventures you would like to have as a player, but it also makes you think more about your character and makes you think about what are you going to be doing in this game, and what roles are you going to play, what stories are you going to tell. And so it really helps everybody to do that.
Oh, that's such a good point. I love the phrase that, a character sheet is a love letter to the GM, right? I put a lot of points in my might pool because I want a story where I get to be awesome and pick up big, heavy things and catapult off of things. I'm telling you, I put a lot of points in here because I want that to come up on screen, right?
Right.
I think this is sort of the next level, right? You can directly ask for those adventure hooks. And if you're a GM who's, eager to respond to your players in that way, you can, and if you've been a GMing for a long time, you should absolutely be able to weave those together, or versions of it, right? You may not be able, you may go off the map, and we're not in the realm where the character's sister wizard even is anymore, but that's showing they want to have these sort of family relationships. Can the wizard pop up later, or was it that you wanted to pull a heist with this wizard, in which case I'm seeing some heist themes. I can weave that into the campaign as a whole. So I think that's such a good point. So we're opening up this sort of advanced GMing section with starting your campaign, starting with characters. But even with this sort of a couple sessions in, I think there's some other advice that we would give sort of advanced GMs of things that you can do to sort of jumpstart the health and the awesomeness of your whole campaign by a couple things you can do in the early stages. And I think it's really important to be checking in with your players over the course of those first few sessions. So one of those things that you might be watching for is, is everyone getting the kind of play that they're expecting or hoping with their character, or are they feeling like they chose the wrong abilities to engage with this kind of story, right?
Right.
So that's definitely one thing. What are some other advice you have about checking in with players as a GM?
Well, first and foremost, I think, after a couple of sessions and maybe, every couple of sessions, right, the GM can kind of check in and just make sure everyone's having a good time. Right? I know that seems so silly to even have to mention, but something that we might forget to do. And if a player is sitting there and boy, the other players are getting a lot more sort of screen time than they are, and they're starting to feel more and more left out or whatever. The GM needs to know that. And you might not pick up on their social cues that that's happening. You might not notice it. Hopefully you do, but why risk it? Why not just ask, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When I was first starting out as a GM, I was so hungry for that feedback. But I think the way that you ask for that feedback and the way that you check in with players is something you kind of grow into as a GM, right? Like I used to be like, tell me everything, how was this? I felt bad about that. And it can be too overwhelming, right? So one way that I like to keep it pretty simple about those check-ins is to kind of have a quick like, hey, tell me something you liked about the session. Tell me something that's not working. So, that you didn't like as much, right? So that can be we have 5 minutes at the end of a session, and I just want a little bit to take the temperature. But like you're saying, I think there's value both in these sort of quick, light check-ins, maybe at the end of most sessions or some sessions. And you may also find that you need to have more large scale check-ins, if there's sort of a problem you're trying to diagnose or things feel off, or if you're just setting yourself up for the big finale. I find that I like to really check in with my players to make sure that finale takes off for everybody by having a big conversation with it as a group, or even scheduling one-on-one. What are your character arcs that you really need to see come on screen before we wrap up this campaign?
Yeah. Again, not to keep tooting Invisible Sun's horns, but that is built right into the game, right? That at the end of every session, you kind of give a summary of how your character felt about everything that happened and whatnot. But you can also use that to find out how the player felt everything went. But I want to make the point, because it's an important one and it gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, and that is what you're not doing is you're not saying necessarily, how am I doing as a GM? Like, that's a part of it, but the real important check-in here is, how are you doing, right? Are you enjoying things? Are you getting what you want out of it, right? Because it's a group experience, right? It's not like, it's not like you're the performer and you just want feedback from your audience.
Right.
You want to just make sure, as sort of the facilitator, that everyone's having a good time. And so you're not putting people on the spot and expecting them to only say wonderful praise about you. That's not the point of this, right?
And I've had great GMs who are clearly doing a great job in a game experience that I was not enjoying because I didn't think I signed up for that particular experience. Right. So yeah. I think it's a really important distinction to make. That's a great one. And the one that was hard for me to make when I first started out. But I think plurality of experiences, right? This whole endeavor is fabulous because we can tell so many kinds of stories, so many different ways. So just checking in with whether your players are all engaged in what's happening at the table or not. That's what the feedback you're looking for.
There's a topic here that I know you and I both really enjoy, Darcy, and that is the idea of having two GMs, right? And so again, we're talking about it in this video because we're talking about kind of starting out campaigns, and obviously this is probably something that you would do from the get-go. Mm-hmm. But why do you love the idea of having two GMs with one group?
I love it because it gives me someone else to bounce off of narratively, right? So I love bouncing off of my players, but having another GM means there's someone with like similar narrative control as I do. And so I get like delighted and surprised by seeing the stuff that we planned together sort of take form in ways I didn't expect, and to see the stuff that I didn't plan at all. Like it makes me feel like I have those player moments, right? Like I'm being taken along for this cool, weird ride because my co-GM has brought in this totally wild card that I didn't expect, and now I get to react to that. So it just adds another sort of degree of freedom, of kind of beautiful chaos that I love. And then the other thing is the purely logistical, organizational element of it, which is that when one GM, I can only split my brain so many ways at a given second. And so when I am narrating, I'm just going to be doing a little less great of a job, like while words are physically coming out of my mouth, at all the other stuff that I like to do when I GM, like looking around the table and seeing who's engaged. Does everyone have water, right? The sort of host duties that are not always, but are often tied up into who might be GMing. So sort of like checking in with players, looking ahead in my notes, trying to come up with something clever because the players thwarted me and I need to find a solution for something, right? All these processes can be happening. And if I have a co-GM, sometimes they're taking the lead narratively, and I have a second to breathe and check in with my players, look around, look ahead in my notes. And so I just love the extra brain capacity it gives me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love having a co-GM for those same reasons, but also because so there is a conceit in a role-playing game, right? That there's a GM, there's some multiple number of players, and so we're all going to as players, we're all going to kind of act in concert, and we're all going to sort of act through the conduit of the GM, which is great and fine, and it works 99.9% of the time. But two GMs actually kind of they give the players more freedom, and they give the story more freedom is really what I'm getting at. And what I mean by that is, while the GM is, or while what GM1, right, is narrating the big, huge battle with the giant robot, right, if you've got somebody else who wants to, sneak around and go, untie the captive scientist or whatever, the other GM can swoop in and literally run that at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it just suddenly becomes much more organic, and it feels more real. I've had experiences with multiple GMs where, like, the players did exactly what everyone says not to do, right? They split the party.
Yep.
But that's what we wanted them to do, because then it allowed us to each kind of take half of the group off and do things, and then because communication between the two groups was limited, then we could make that a part of the game, right? And suddenly, like, if you wanted to send a message to the other group, you talk to the GM, and that GM conveyed the message. And that kind of experience, it just feels more organic and real, I think, if you've got sort of multiple GM minds at work at once and in two different places.
When you start a game with the idea that you'll have two GMs too, like Troy Pitchelman and I ran a predation time travel, two tables, right? So like 12 players, having people swap seats and things. Like, there's a lot of fun you can have with, like, asking yourself, what opportunities do we have when you can split the role of the GM into two bodies that can move and can share or withhold different information? There's a ton of fun to be had there, and I highly recommend, if no one's ever tried it before, pick a friend willing to take the plunge with you, because I think you'll learn a lot in the process, and it'll be really fun.
There's also a kind of a variant on two GMs, and that is the GM assistant.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen this work out really well. Like sometimes, like, I had a friend who had a son who was, maybe like 9 or so, and wanted to be a part of the experience, but wasn't probably really in a position to run a character,
right?
But helped, like, get all the right books when the GM needed it, and kind of do the kind of hosting things you were talking about, and just sort of managing the stats and getting the dice out, and like all those things. It's almost like having a caddy, I guess. But sometimes you've got someone who doesn't want to be a full part of the game, but they want to be a part of the social group.
Yep.
And that's one way to do it, right?
Oh, that's so interesting. The GM assistant, I've also, I feel like I see it get talked a lot about as like a friend who can sort of just handle the rules for you, right? If you want a new GM who wants to try their hand at this sort of storytelling element, but doesn't feel confident in their mastery of all the rules, you have this sort of assistant who's a real expert. But I've also seen that exactly the role that you described, where it's someone who wants to be involved, who isn't ready to GM, or maybe isn't quite sure they'll like the play experience, or haven't role played before, and who just who help out the GM in all these other ways, right? Getting the right books, even being sort of like a conversationalist, right? Like, I know someone who would not admit that they were GMing, right? They were functionally coming up with amazing plots and weaving things together. They were doing the prep work of GMing, but they were just a little too nervous to do it on screen, in the moment. And so it was kind of an on-ramp for GMing. So yeah, take an assistant under your wing, share all these great, lessons that you've learned with someone new. I think that's a really neat way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's kind of close out this video, and just so everybody knows, right? We're taking the advanced GMing and we're kind of dividing it up into sections. So we're going to be doing multiple advanced GMing videos here. But let's talk about again, because we're talking about the beginning, right? Let's talk about adventure hooks, right? And like that's a basic GM thing, like just getting players involved. But what are some more sort of advanced kinds of ideas that a GM can use to get the players engaged and involved in things rather than, hey, here's a guy, he wants to give you 100 gold pieces to go do this thing?
Yeah. So one thing I probably want to reference a little bit is that how you build your kind of your various like plots, or the various adventure hooks, or the various adventures, or overall kind of activities of the game, or the story of the game. We talked before about, in our adventure creation video, about kind of staggering different plot lines and plot threads, right? And so one of the techniques that I think you can get good at is thinking about, referencing, or setting something up for something to be a plot hook later, right? So a lot of what we're trying to do is getting player investment, right, in these plot hooks. You want them to take the hook, right? You want them to be interested in it and invested. And so one way we've already talked about is asking the player directly, and I think there's a lot that can go into that, right? Saying what kinds of things would your character really be invested in and want to check out? What kind of stories do you see them having? And another way is, over the course of delivering the mail to the, demon empress of Gone or whatever, right? That's one little like, adventure your people go on. They meet an NPC who they really like. I start to see those, what players are already gravitating toward. I love seeing those as like the proto hooks, right? I'm like, okay, what can happen with that character now that I know they're invested, that will help me drag them into this other part of the story that I've sort of imagined us going toward. So that's sort of the layering, I think, is something that's a bit of an advanced GM technique.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm a huge proponent of the proactive player, and it's simply because if the player decides to do something, then that they're doing what they want to do, right? They're having the kind of a play experience that they want to be having,
right?
And so like it's one thing to have them go do a task for somebody. It's another thing for them to decide what that task should be on their own, right? And so, like, the more you can, again, I guess we're going back to the very beginning of this video, right? The more you can talk to the players and find out what they want, then you can dangle that in front of the players. Like, we mentioned, maybe there's a guy, maybe you're playing a cyberpunk style game, and this guy really wants to move up in the corporate ranks and become a big shot in the corporation. Well, make some opportunities for advancement suddenly, make themselves available, and then the player needs to go forth and choose what that is and figure out how to make that happen, right? I think that's what's really exciting. Like Darcy, you mentioned heists, right?
Yeah.
A heist is great because it's almost certainly all player driven, right? There's a thing, you want that thing, how are you going to get the thing?
Right. Yeah, I think also, sometimes if you have a player who is has some kind of like moral goal or like code, right? You can have just a situation. You can just have them passing, some town in desperate need, right? And it's just on the way to some place they were going, but like a player that has built a character that wants to sort of help people around it, or like has some even more specific hook, right? Like, oh my goodness, it's people from like your clan, right? Like, right. Here, you don't have to say, wouldn't you like to help them? The player will sort of dive in and do the work of hooking all the other players around them by having an in-character sort of impassioned speech. Let's go help these people. I need to do it. It's my part of my code. It's always a relief when the players take the bait like that. Every once in a while, they do not take it the way you think you will, and that's why all the other techniques that I think we can talk about are helpful.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think don't hesitate to use the player's background, right? Don't just have a guy show up and say, I'll give you 100 gold pieces to do this thing. Have the player's brother show up and want this to have happen, right? Like, another point that I think is very, very closely related to that is, there's a silly little kind of grandmother saying, which is, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? That's actually true of motivating players too. I have found, like, if you want the players to do something, or rather not do something, maybe you want them to overcome a challenge, but you don't want them to do it the easy way, right? You want to make it more interesting. You can use threats, right? You can have some big evil guy come in and say, if you do that thing, I'm gonna pound you or whatever. But that isn't really, that's a motivation to fight that guy. That's not a motivation, right? And that's not really channeling the players where you want. So much more effective is to have and develop an NPC that the players love, right? And have them say, oh, don't do that thing, right? Because that is such, psychologically, it's a much stronger motivation to help someone that you like rather than, go against someone that you don't. And so that's a great hook, right? But that requires creating NPCs that the players trust and love and want to help, right? That's a trap that GMs fall into is all the NPCs end up being untrustworthy and whatnot. But have somebody who is just awesomely wonderful, and then that person just becomes your best tool ever.
Yeah. Sometimes you get to a point where you're in a campaign and you're in some new area, or you're time crunched, or you're running a one shot, right? And so sometimes you don't have the background to lay that track. And so I know this is always my one piece of advice, but I think it's relevant here. It's something I find myself using a lot, is like, especially in a one shot, right? The NPC that you want all the players to fall in love with, right? Ask the player, tell me about what, give me the little story about how they made your character absolutely adore them, right? Like, tell me why your character is invested in this character or this hook. I think that's my shortcut to, oh God, the players, the characters don't have the investment in this hook that I need them to be invested in. I turn to my players to help me come up with that narrative reason, and then they're usually very willing to go along with it.
Sure, I think that's great. And the other thing that is also related to that is, we talk about GMs railroading players, and that's bad. But what we don't ever really seem to talk about is when players railroad the GM, and that's good. And here's what I mean by that, right? So you've got your NPC and you want that person to be really influential and like you were saying, but your attempts at getting the players to love that person just aren't working.
Yeah.
It's rubbing them the wrong way or whatever. But they are taking to this other person that you thought was just some throwaway character. Shift all the responsibility and the weight that you were putting on the one character onto the second character. Right? Let the players lead you by the nose, and if they really, if you want them to go to the castle, but they really want to go to the city by the river, take the adventure that you were going to put in the castle and make it in the city by the river, and they're going where they want to go, and you're having the adventure that you already put a lot of work into, right?
So I think we should probably conclude our opening salvo of advanced GMing advice here. And we're going to open up the next video a little bit, talking about kind of tone and mood and ways that you communicate things to players, right? A lot of the words that you use are going to lead players in directions that you hopefully want them to be led, are going to set expectations in ways that you want them to be expected. So we're going to talk a lot about how, over the course of your, a given session and over the course of campaigns, how do we curate the game experience we want to have. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode about sort of setting yourself up for great advanced GMing success. And we hope you tune in to our next video. And in the meantime, you can be following along with all of this advice and more in Your Best Game Ever. You can find out more about that at yourbestgameever.com. And I am so eager to hear about all of your experiences. So please talk about how you set your campaigns up for greatness, awesome GMs, and hashtag it Your Best Game Ever so I can find it. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.